my discussion for Chapter 8, I really just want to bring home a couple of points. So I noticed that most of you in your definitions of social change suggested that there needs to be some big need out there. There needs to be dissatisfaction about that need. There needs to be a person or a small group of people who have an idea and are willing to act on it. There needs to be some kind of effort to motivate even more people. A lot of you included a readiness or ripeness, you could call it, a tipping point. And most of you ended it there. I want to just suggest that, and some of you mentioned structural change, which was part of the Mulligan reading, and I want to just suggest that I think that social change must absolutely have a structural component in order to actually be social change. If you think about this fire, this series of fires, I heard today the fire chief in California, somebody asked him when fire season would be over, and he basically said there is no fire season anymore. And the reporter, there was a moment of confusion and quiet, and the reporter said no fire season, and the fire chief said it's year-round. There is no season. We are now experiencing fires year-round. There is no doubt about it among scientists that the dry environment that is leading to a much increased incident of fire in the west and the southwest and all up and down the coast and through Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, that this is one of the results of climate change. So some of you may not think climate change is a thing. We know that there are a group of people who don't think that it's a thing. The first group of people who thought climate change was a thing, besides the scientists, was actually the insurance industry. And they know it's a thing because they're the ones shelling out for all of the damage. But if you think about what actually has to happen for us to begin to reverse climate change, it requires more than an awareness, more than a tipping point, because I think, most of the world believes that climate change is a thing. It requires more than innovation. There have been many, many innovative ideas. It requires, so what am I missing? People, group of people, tipping point, innovative ideas. It seems to require something else. And one of you, I think it may have been Celeste. I'm sorry, Celeste, if it wasn't you, and I'm sorry to whomever it was if it wasn't Celeste. But one of you said that we're going to have to network through the entire world to get on top of some of these social problems, and I think that in this case that's true. So some kind of a connection that connects us all in the entire world in a not just a meaningful way, but in a way that moves us all to action, and something about that way that actually has to also somehow bring down the barriers that in part, of course, we can blame it on companies that don't want to change their way of doing things, don't want to go to sustainable practices, don't want to give up chemicals and plastic and taking down the rainforest and that kind of thing. We can look at the impacts of industry on our climate, but at some other level we have to look in the mirror and be motivated to stop wanting stuff, to think about life as a collection of rich experiences instead of a collection of things. And I think that is like a battle against human nature. And why am I giving you this little conversation? I think that of all of the conversations, the discussions that you guys have had, it's this discussionate that I have really wished that we were all in a classroom and we could have spent an hour and a half batting about these ideas. Some of your ideas were fabulous. I put comments in everybody's grade book. Some of your ideas made me think of, made my mind go off in other directions. Some of them raised questions for me. But the main thing that my mind kept doing was asking every time you came up with a new theory or what the pieces were, would this be enough for social change? Would this be enough for social change? What about that thing? What about this thing? And I think the reason that my mind went there is because it's so clear to me right now that social change can happen for the better or it can happen for the worse. And social change can seem like it's for the better in some ways and yet have unintended consequences in other ways. I think the Industrial Revolution is a really good example of something that changed the way we live, but also set the stage for the kinds of industry that are creating a lot of the problems that our planet is experiencing. And I guess what I really want to know is, let me back that up. When you think about the elements of social change that you guys have noted, it's, people who care and are willing to do something, an idea that is innovative and will truly change how things work out, a readiness, a tipping point, a ripeness for something to happen, and then some kind of mechanism that perpetuates this idea throughout the areas where social change is needed, which of course in the case of climate change is the whole world. In some countries a problem may be local to within the borders. And I think about that change could be for good or for bad. I think I mentioned the Industrial Revolution because it is good, but it had unintended bad consequences that took a very long time to understand. But you can also think about actual changes that are destructive. You can think about changes that took hold of people. I made some notes. I'm going to have to go to them. Hang on a second. Maybe I didn't write this down. I don't know, but yeah, okay. So, you can think of when people have had a clarity of vision, but it was a destructive vision, to move the Native Americans off their land, or to take care of the Jewish problem, or to spread a particular religion or even ideology throughout the civilized world, even if it means, like massing armies and taking many lives. Okay, so there is this vision, and then you have people who are willing to do it, usually people in power. And then sometimes you literally have a mass hysteria that goes with it. Think of the Crusades. Think of the people of who lived under the regime of the Third Reich. think about the acceptance of all of America for the way that we have treated Native Americans, the way that we treated the Japanese during World War II, the way that I'm trying to think. I should be able to think of lots more, but because I want to, I can't. But you guys can certainly, and the way we're treating, women and children and families at the border right now. I guess what I'm getting at is those same elements that create positive social change have also been there to create negative social change. And I guess I just want to point that out. Another thing that I want to point out really quickly is that a lot of you did not have the structural or systems piece in your social change theory. And for me, this again goes back to this whole idea of, is it innovation or is it just a great program that works? In this case, I'm not necessarily asking if it's innovation, but I'm asking, is it really social change if it doesn't change something about the system or the structure so that nothing is the same again? Some of you talk about, what you really need is this idea, these people, this ripeness, and a willingness to just persevere until change happens. But I can see, and in fact, I can think of different programs that were really innovative and really did make a difference. But when the people who were doing them moved on, there was no change. I'll give you a really perfect example of this. I still have a friend who was before his time, and he developed a community for the homeless where basically they worked together to determine what their community would look like, and they came up with a business idea to help teach people employment skills if they needed it, or put them to work and to generate funds for their community. And he had this whole thing going. The difference was, instead of hiring, people who did have homes to come in and create all of this for people who didn't have homes, they basically created a community with beds and places to live and places to eat and workshops and all that stuff. And they created it themselves as homeless, as people without homes, and then now they have a place to sleep, but they also ran this facility themselves. And not saying they did everything themselves. Sometimes they needed to hire people, and money was raised to put up infrastructure and whatever. And it was a great idea. It was probably the first ever organization that I have heard of that flipped from that, oh, you are needy and we can save you mentality, to, oh, you have the ability and all you need is somebody to give you a hand up. And I loved what he was doing. But when something happened in his life and his partner's life, I don't even remember what it was, but they had to step away from it. And there was nothing really in place after they walked away from it. Not only did the project itself roll up, but nothing really had changed about how the world looked at people without homes. It was a little microcosm that changed the perspective of only the people that it touched, and only for the time that it was going. I think, for me, my definition of social change, however, whether it's a small thing that takes a minute or it's a huge thing that takes a really long time to pull off, the outcome has to be some change to the system that is significant enough that after that change is made, things are different. I mean, just think about think about the airplane. Think about how the world changed after the airplane became a thing, right? I mean, nothing was ever the same after that. And that's a product. But you can think of ideological changes or moral changes for the good or for the bad. You can think about, I don't know, you can think about the Me Too movement. There's something that is so powerful about the Me Too movement. I don't think that it's going to go back into its box. I could be wrong about that, but I'd like to believe that it's really going to have a transformative change on the way that we look at sexual harassment, and it's going to have a transformative change on our culture, I hope. But at any rate, my point is, I don't think without a structure change, which is what Mulligan called it, and he wrote a long time ago, and what we now call a systems change, without a true change like that, that we're going to have something really different. There were some other things I wanted to talk to you about. I guess I wanted to talk to you about something called the garbage can model, garbage can theory. This was a theory that was created by a guy named two guys named March and Olson. And their theory, it's going to sound a little nuts. I'm going to give you a link down below, but and invite you to take a look at it. It sounds a little nuts. Their theory is that there are a lot of solutions that are just floating around out there. You know, if you think about it, you know, when you go out for a glass of wine or a cup of coffee with a friend and you're talking about a social problem, you know, everybody's got ideas, right? And of course, that's the same in government agencies and in Congress and probably at the level of the presidency of the United States. There's always ideas being tossed around, right? And sometimes an idea grabs hold and gets, you know, people run with it. And sometimes, you know, really good ideas just float around. Sometimes the idea that is grabbed hold of is not the best idea, but it might be the politically palatable idea. Anyway, the point is there's a whole bunch of ideas out there for every problem, and there's a whole bunch of problems out there looking for ideas. And the garbage can model says they're all thrown into this sort of environment together, and it's almost happenstance of, or you could call it the perfect storm, that a particular idea gets pulled out of the garbage can to apply to a problem. And what is, you know, what makes up that perfect storm? So we've already touched on some of the elements. The community needs to be ripe for change. They need to be ready for it in one way or another. They may not know that's the change they're anticipating, but they must be in some way ready for change. And if they're not, then, you know, they'll fight change. So if the status quo is of benefit to them, or if they think it is from a cultural perspective, from cultural beliefs, and they fight it, then something might not be grabbed onto. So the people need to be ready. And they may not, again, know that they're ready for that thing, but if they're dissatisfied enough about something, then you know, perhaps they'll be ready for that thing. It needs to be a thing that, it has to be on the agenda of the people who set the agenda. And I don't think that your readings actually talk about this, but if you think about it, I'll give you a really good example. So the Affordable Care Act was passed during the Obama administration, aka the Obamacare, right? And when we moved up toward 2016, one of the things that happened was the Republicans campaigned heavily on the idea that they were going to strip away Obamacare. In the meantime, every big idea is something on paper, especially a legislative idea, a congressional policy idea, something on paper that a bunch of people have negotiated out, and they hope it will work, right? But it's just a big, fat public experiment. And so when you see it as a big, fat experiment, you know that when you actually try it, if you've ever tried anything for the first time, if you happen to have ever taught or given a speech, you sometimes try the thing you're going to do in a classroom beforehand on friends or your kids or whatever to see where the glitches are so you can improve it. You might give your speech out loud in the mirror or to your significant other or to a family member to see what seems to work and where you can see them sort of wandering so you can tighten it up. Every time we try a public program, it's an experiment. It's a social experiment. The Affordable Care Act was also a social experiment. And right away, certain things didn't work, right? You remember that the marketplace, which was online, was horrible for a while. It was slow. It took hours. It was too complicated. And they sort of fixed that by creating a money pot to train people to take people through it. And that was a semi-fix for that for the time being. But anyway, there was a bipartisan group of Congress people who sat down together with the people who wrote the bill, and they basically went through all the things that they could see were not working the way they were intended. And they came up with a plan of fixes for the Affordable Care Act. And they brought that to the leadership, the congressional and senatorial leadership, in the first year of President Trump's presidency. But because there was a political promise to wipe Obamacare off the map, those bipartisan fixes did not even get a hearing. And remember, I'm mentioning this in the context of who sets the agenda and whether a social change idea can even be heard. Because if the people who are setting the agenda have decided that they are not going to hear or listen to or entertain ideas, then when I was a lobbyist, we used to call that throwing it in the drawer. They just threw it in the drawer and it's not coming out. So it doesn't matter how great the idea is. If it's not on the agenda of the people who set the agenda, an idea may never see the light of day, no matter how good it is. And then I think the other thing, and I mentioned this before, is that there are often countervailing power or countervailing reasons, barriers for change. And sometimes, in spite of those countervailing forces, change happens. I think the Me Too movement is a good example of that again. But I think other times the powers that exist, that like the status quo, it's keeping them in power, it's part of the system that works for them. They're in power, and the more powerful they are, the more powerful they're able to become because of the benefits of being in power. And a lot of times change that needs to happen, it has to be a tinderbox before that can be overcome. And you can look back into history and you can see the examples of actually armed revolution or something like that having to happen before change happens. So why am I saying all these things? I guess I'm just saying all these things because I think a real theory of social change has to take into account some stuff that we didn't totally talk about. I think some of you got to it, but and I'll just briefly list them again. There has to be a readiness or a ripeness among a huge number of people for change. They have to be open to it, and that could happen in a number of different ways. It just depends on the issue, but lots and lots of people have to be ready for it. there have to be some people who are brave enough to actually move a thing forward. It has to be a timing in which the powers that be either can't stop the thing from getting on the agenda, like the Me Too thing, or agree to let it on the agenda, which I think now we'll see that the Republicans are more interested in at least entertaining some fixes to the Affordable Care Act, because they just learned from the election that a lot of people did not want to see the pre-existing conditions stripped away, and so there's going to have to be some acknowledgement of that. And there have to be enough countervailing force to overcome the barriers, whether they're cultural or whether they're governance barriers or whether they're structural barriers. And finally, whatever the innovation or change is, it has to be something that changes the actual structure of how things happen, because otherwise, when the effort starts to wane or we get distracted from it or whatever, it will just go away. And you can think about how upset people get, how 2/3 of America would like to see gun control legislation, and every other week there is a horrible mass killing now, it seems like, and we are up in arms for a few days and then we go back to our lives. I am not sure why that is, but it's clear to me that we're not at a tipping point, because if we are, we would basically let our elected officials know that if they were going to kowtow to the NRA, that that we weren't going to vote them in again, or I don't know what we would do, but we would do something, right? We have, and you might be on the other side of this issue, and I'm not saying this because I'm trying to make a political point. I'm saying it because when 66%, and those are the latest polls, 66% of Americans are for reasonable, rational gun control, which is not the same as saying take all guns away from everybody. It's stuff like background checks and waiting periods and the ability to call in and say, you know, we need to have guns taken away from people that have shown a propensity to be dangerous to themselves or to others, and other rules like that are already out there. We're not waiting for these ideas. They're on the table, but somehow we're not there yet. We're not there yet, and you can just look at all those factors. All right, let me see if there was anything else I wanted. Yeah, I'm just thinking about any of this. I guess not. I guess that's pretty much what I want to say about it. And I would just ask you to think about those factors, especially in light of what is missing with our big problems that a lot of people are aware of, where there is a lot of agreement, like, you know, rational gun control, or like making some changes, you know, why do we pull out of the Paris Accords over climate change, you know, that kind of thing. What is it about this situation that, even though most people are in agreement with it, that catalyst, that motive, that readiness, what would have to happen to trigger that so that there could be real change, or what kind of barriers would have to be brought down? And I'm putting the flip side of this conversation, the negative side, the what will we have to do to make it work? What do we have to fix to make it work? Because I'd really like you to think about these hard questions. I would love you to think about these hard questions. This was a great conversation. I know you guys are all past it already. You're down in discussion 10. But I just wanted to say I wished I could get you all in a room to just sort of hash this out and see if we could come up with a theory that would work in like every situation. even with these big ideas. Wouldn't it be cool if, because we're not political, we're just a bunch of students, if we could come up with a way to look at this that was so cool that it surpassed all the politics, and that itself was an innovation. All right, anyway, I am on to grade your next things. So thank you for putting up with this, and I will see you on the discussion board.